Welcome to Crisis Management Institute's online resource for parents and for teachers whose children or students have been impacted by a suicide. My name is Sherry Levery. I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a teacher, and I'm a crisis responder. My entire professional life has been responding mostly to schools, but to a range of tragedies and crises that almost always involve youth. It is always sad when youth have to face a death, but a loss to suicide is one of the most difficult deaths any of us have to face. Often, parents and teachers wonder whether we should talk openly about a death by suicide. There are very sound reasons to consider the consequences of the decisions that we make at times like this, because the stakes are so high. This resource is designed to give you some ways to consider the outcomes of the choices that you have about whether or how to talk with youth in the aftermath of losing someone to suicide. There are many ways youth can be impacted by a suicide. It will be different if the youth lost a family member than if it was a peer or fellow student, and different if the peer was a good friend versus someone who was more of an acquaintance. But no matter what the connection, suicide is always difficult. Sometimes it is about the pain of losing a dear friend, or perhaps it is the angst of having had a disagreement that wasn't resolved before the death. But even if the death is of someone that the student or youth doesn't know well, just the awareness that suicide can touch the lives of those we know will, for some youth, stir up all kinds of difficult emotions and reactions. Our world pushes youth to grow up quickly, and our media thrusts them into awareness about the dark side of life. As caring adults, we want very much to help youth keep whatever naivete they have. But on the other hand, we want them to talk openly to us about the things that concern them. As difficult as it is, this is one of those times in life that, rather than do what is comfortable for us, we need to do what is best for them. As much as we all feel like we know our kids, adults are often surprised to learn some of the parts of how youth usually think and operate. Without really knowing it, youth are very loyal to their perceptions and their misperceptions about what they think we are saying with our actions. At the same time, we often fool ourselves into believing that if youth don't bring it up, perhaps it isn't bothering them. Nearly always, nothing could be further from the truth. Suicide brings with it a whole host of new fears and reactions. Students look to the adults, and if we don't bring it up, they surmise any number of things. They may believe that this means we don't have the capacity to talk about it. They may think that our silence means that we think that they should somehow be able to make sense of this on their own. Some may believe that they are the only ones that are struggling. Commonly, when a child first begins to understand death, it is haunting for them to imagine what it really is. And then to ponder what it means that someone would intentionally take his or her own life throws in a dimension that is really difficult for all of us. So one reflection is to ponder whether you want your children to go through this haunting, difficult time feeling alone, or whether you want them to feel connected to you and to trust that when there is something that concerns them, you are willing to listen. For most adults, when they think of it in that way, the answer is yes, that indeed they do want the youth in their lives to know that if something is worrisome, you're willing to take time with them to think it through, or that you're willing at least to listen. Another point to ponder is how we divide into two groups those things that we do or do not want our children to tell us. If your daughter becomes pregnant, do you want her to turn to someone outside of the family for help, or to come to you? If your son is feeling crazy trying to cope with the emotions that run from excited to depressed, and perhaps he is manifesting the beginning signs of bipolar disorder, do you want him to turn to you or to try to manage it himself? What if your daughter's boyfriend is coercive or abusive or controlling, and she can't figure out how to get out of that relationship? As a principal or a teacher, do you want students to let you know if they know that a friend is bringing a gun to school? It seems the difficult part of this is that for many issues in life, there are more certain answers, but for suicide, there are always unanswered questions. As adults in the world, we feel like we should always have advice for our children. That if they turn to us, we should be able to solve their problems, if only they'd let us. So one thing to ponder is whether your reluctance to talk with your children about suicide has more to do with your own discomfort than theirs. For most of us, knowing that we are not alone in a struggle is comforting. Now think about how much our kids need that in difficult times. It isn't that kids don't bring it up because they're okay with what's happened. Most often it is because our nonverbal messages to them suggest that perhaps we aren't willing, or perhaps that we aren't feeling equipped for our side of the conversation. So here are some tips. First is, you don't have to become an instant counselor. As a parent, a teacher, a school counselor, or administrator, it is more important that the door for deep and intimate communication be open than it is for you to have answers. In fact, the sooner you realize that we don't have the answers, the better off everyone will be. The point isn't to have the answers. That's what makes this so difficult. We think we're supposed to have the answers, the right advice, that we should be able to take away the pain for our kids. But that just doesn't work. The point is to be sure that your child hears that you want nothing more than to have the trust and the privilege of being able to be engaged in his or her life. The point is that sometimes, and this is one of those times, it is ever so much more important for you to listen than to speak. For some, the intimacy of sharing from such a deep place is uncomfortable. If well done, it has many long silences. It is filled with moments when all you can do is look into the eyes of these children and love them. The way we get through coping with a death by suicide isn't to have the answers. We will never know why. It is to be there for one another, even when what each of us thinks might be the answers are very different. So here are some starting places for having that discussion with your child. First is to stop thinking that what you say matters most, that your advice can take away their pain, and to realize that the most important thing you can do is to listen. Remember, you don't have to have the answers this time. Really, our job is to help our kids cope with the fact that the most difficult parts of life are not black and white, but gray. Let's look at what kids need. They need to know that no matter how they feel about this, you want to listen. They need to know that no matter how great their mistakes have been, you love them fiercely. They need to know that you realize that sometimes when you think you know what's best for them, and even if you might be right, it is more pressure than they can bear, or a higher expectation than they can meet. One way we often unintentionally stop the conversation is to ask them questions that make them feel defensive. Why is one of those questions. As soon as someone asks us why we did something, we pretty much have to defend ourselves. Let's take cheating. So you leave work a little bit early, but you sign up for your usual time. What is the difference in being asked, "Why did you cheat?" versus, "I notice that sometimes people who work here fudge on their time cards." Or, "What are some of the reasons that people would fudge on their time cards? What could we as a company do to help people be willing to be accurate on their time cards?" When we are confronted directly, Pretty much our only option is to defend ourselves. But look at all the ways someone can engender a discussion about time cards that would perhaps bring about real change in the company. And so it is with kids. If we ask them why they cheat, we're likely to get very little information. But if we ask what kinds of pressures bring kids to cheat, we're going to get a whole lot more. And so it is with suicide. Let's look at several different kinds of examples. One is that your child has lost a friend or a peer to suicide. There is nothing more that a young person wants than for a caring adult to listen to what is difficult. You can't take away the pain, but by listening with an open mind and a loving heart, you may learn all kinds of things that you won't learn if you're doing most of the talking. You might begin by noting that this is the first time your child has had to face a suicide in his or her life. John, we've never had to face this before, and even though you know what it's like to lose a grandparent, this is the first time that you've lost someone to suicide. I didn't have to deal with that when I was your age, so there's a lot I really don't know about how this might be for you. Tell me how this is for you. Then have the courage to listen and not to immediately give an idea or solution or a reason for your child not to feel the way he or she feels. Just nod silently and encourage them to say more. And still, before you give any solutions or advice, ask more. How people die gives death different meanings at different times. What does it mean to you that this has happened? Then, tell me more about that. Or, I can imagine that is true for you. Or, I am so glad that you would tell me this. I wouldn't have realized it. You notice that none of these responses give advice or attempt to change how this is for your child or student. That's the goal. Help them put into their own words the deepest, darkest parts of this. It may be true in your case that you did have to deal with a suicide in your life when you were young. If that's so, you might say that although you remember what it was like for you to lose someone to suicide when you were a child, you may also know that it is different for each of us with each death that we face. It might be helpful to mention that you were aware that it was difficult for adults to know how to help you. Many perhaps had no idea what to say. Some may have changed the subject or avoided the conversation altogether. You could acknowledge that you realize that most adults are very uncertain about how to support kids when something like this happens, and that you know that you would like to hear from them what would be the most help. Then as you move through the conversation, it is still important to remember that whatever worked for you isn't necessarily what will help others, so it is still much more critical to listen than to give advice. By your presence, reassure them that you aren't going to abandon them, either physically or emotionally, if they begin to talk about really difficult things. Some other helpful questions might be, what are other students saying about this? Or, how do you feel about what others are saying? And, who are the safe people in your life who are really there for you? Asking, what would you like most from me right now? Is a terrific question. That is how you begin to help kids with their pain. Let them tell you what they really need. But you can't start there because it is through asking questions and listening that they begin to identify just what it is that they do need. Finally, be sure that you leave the door open. I am thinking that as you walk through the next days and have conversations with others, things will feel different. I want to check back in with you over the next few days, but I don't want you to wait for me to ask how it's going. If something is bothering you, let me just listen to see if that helps you figure things out. Kids learn as much by what we don't do as by what we do. Our silence is misleading. Our fears get in the way. We're often afraid that by bringing up the subject of suicide, it will make kids suicidal. But that simply isn't true. Feeling isolated or unworthy or having mental illness can bring kids to think about suicide. Feeling too much pressure or too little support can be overwhelming. Whether you are a parent or a school staff person or have children in your life in some other way, the greatest gift we can give them is the gift of our time and our love. In my many years of responding to deaths from accidents, suicides, homicides, and terrorism, no matter what the circumstance, I've never met a child who didn't want a compassionate adult to listen to their perceptions or to hear their story, even an adult they've never met before that moment. What I do see over and over again is that when we lose a child to suicide, we are suddenly acutely aware that we didn't know that child's story. So by both your actions and your words, let the young people in your life know that you are willing to stick with this difficult process of coping and grappling with what it is like for them to lose someone to suicide. Here is the tough part. We need to be able to say, we won't ever know that. When there is a suicide, the answers died with that person. What we can know is that we'll get through the rough spots in life by taking a deep breath and patiently listening, asking questions, listening more, checking in over the days to come. We get through the rough spots in life by being there for one another. Give your child 100 nonverbal messages of love, a heart of syrup on his pancakes in the morning, a note of love in her backpack, cooking dinner together, tuck-ins at night, even when they've been too old to need that for ages. If you are at all worried about the possibility of a child contemplating suicide, get help immediately. Whether this is your own child, one of your children's friends, a relative, a student in your class. Professionals in the field really do understand a lot about what it takes to save a life, but none of us can do it alone. Take every single threat seriously. And that's the other critical thing to have the courage to ask. Is there anyone that you're worried about in terms of whether they would think about suicide? And finally, ask kids, who would you talk with if you felt that way? When your kids or students realize that you're willing to talk with them about suicide, they realize that you're a safe person to talk with about almost anything. And after all, isn't that what you want all of the time? I really do believe that it's more difficult to parent kids and to teach kids today than it was 20 years ago. But what they want and need is the same as it always has been. Connection, love, acceptance, fair discipline, reasonable boundaries, and the safety of knowing that no matter what, you are there for them. If your child has lost someone to suicide, they need you to be close, to be tender, to be fully present. Have the courage to ask the questions. They are so lucky to have you. Thanks so much for taking the time to view this resource. We have a whole section of free downloads on our website for administrators, counselors, teachers, parents, and students. Please use them however you'd like, as long as you leave them intact exactly as they are, including the copyright and contact information at the bottom of each page. If you're a parent and you have found our website, make sure that your children's schools know about us. We work very hard to support people in the aftermath of terrible events, and we're all about prevention, using every tragedy to learn how to better prevent the next one. Let us know what other kinds of resources would be helpful. We're here for you, so that you can be there for your kids. All of our kids. Thanks so much.